I'm Meghan Reidy, and I'm on the program analytics team in DC. We're going to look at use over need, and use over need, or use as a percent of need, and how that helps us to better understand the market and who the market is paying. So we start with universal health coverage. I think most people have probably heard about universal health coverage. It's about everyone having access to the health care that they need without suffering any financial hardship. And the goal is to get all of everyone's health needs met in a population with the appropriate use of products and services. So universal health coverage requires us to look beyond what PSI is doing and to think about the entire market. But so looking at the entire market means thinking about scale and thinking about Sarah and all of the Sarahs who have need for a health product or service in the market. So all of these Sarahs have need for a health product, but only some of them are using. And we have to think about why only a few of our Sarahs are using these health products and services that they need. So this market potential is our need, and use is the actual market today, and we want to increase use to meet need. So Yasmin often uses an example of Coca-Cola, and if you're marketing Coca-Cola, you want as many people to drink Coke as much as possible every day. But when we're talking about health products and services, there is a cap to the market. We want to think about the market being capped at need. An example of this is with malaria treatment. You think of ACTs. You don't want everyone using ACTs for every fever, for every sign of some illness. You only want people who actually have malaria to be using ACTs. So we think about that market as being capped by the health need, the real need for ACTs. And so you don't want, everyone every day to be using ACTs. So how do we come up with this need? What we look at is the population at risk. And to do that, we think about what is our health need specifically and how are we addressing it. So if we're talking about, say, malaria treatment, we need to think about how many people actually have malaria, how many incident cases of malaria are there in a year. So we think about the population who's at risk and the epidemiological factors that are involved. So we think about demography and epidemiology to quantify this population at risk. So let's look at an example. As we've discussed earlier, we've been applying this use as a percent of need in a few different contexts. So I'll look at family planning as one of them. So calculating family planning need in Mozambique, you have to think about not all women have need for family planning. Only women of reproductive age who don't want to get pregnant and are actually having sex have need for family planning. We look at different sources of data like DHS surveys, use census information to come up with a calculation for who those women really are. And we sort of think through the logical chain of what defines need. Once we've thought of that, we also have to think about target groups and subgroups who might have slightly different need. One example of this is in Zimbabwe, in the context of the STAR project with HIV self-testing, just looking at, thinking of how need is defined and thinking of that discipline. In this case, we said that all HIV negative and HIV unknown women ages 15 to 49 have need for HIV testing. But then within that, we've also identified some subgroups who are higher risk populations who might have a slightly different need. And that, thinking about the different types of need is important when you're talking about the population at risk and getting from the population at risk to universe of need. So thinking about the products and services required to meet the need and to think about that entire market potential. So if you look at the HIV testing example, the women who are HIV unknown or HIV negative, their frequency of testing is only one time a year versus women in a higher risk group who have 2+ partners or female sex workers, they have need for testing of 2 times a year. And if we further define the whole market, think about where there are overlaps in populations, thinking about who everyone is in the population. Remember that there are also women who have already tested positive and they don't need tests at all. So if we're defining our health need and using that to define our market potential, then that way we're able to identify the number of products needed in a year. So that's a brief overview of how we calculate need, but then we have use in the market. So what we're looking at is what is the actual market today? Who are the women using, or not women, Sarahs, who are the people using a given health product or service? And there are a lot of different questions that we need to think about when thinking. Here's an example that from the Unitate RDT project, which has been talked about a little bit already today, looking at identifying the same sort of thought process that we looked at for family planning of who has need for malaria testing. In this situation, we're looking at private sector, but we need to look at the entire market, looking at private sector and the public sector. And then when we're going through and looking at use, people who are tested with an RDT are using, and that's what our project is focusing on, but people who are tested with microscopy also are using. It might not be what we're focused on, but they still are using an appropriate product or service. So we have to think back and look at the entire market and not just focus on what we're doing, but look at different ways of appropriately meeting use. Once we've identified the need and the use, we have to look at what is the gap between the need and the use and think about how we can address it. And there are different lenses that we can use to look at that gap. So we can look at gender, age, risk behavior, geography, wealth, and use those lenses to dig down and look at this gap between use and need. So going back to our family planning example, we can look at married women and unmarried women. They have 2 different risk groups, have 2 different uses. If you look, with the married women, there's a much bigger gap between use and need for married women than there is for unmarried women in Mozambique. And so that's one lens that we can use to look at geography. Rural women have a much bigger gap between use and need than urban women. So the market is failing those women there. Looking at a different lens of wealth quintile, the women in the lowest quintile have a bigger gap between use and need than the women in the highest quintile. And if you notice these circles, they're actually to scale. So it's hard to tell with circles, but the women in the highest quintile have actually a larger need, and that's because there's a larger demand for family planning in the highest quintile. And that's an example of how, sometimes in a more complicated area like family planning, demand actually shapes need. So in this case, each of these quintiles have the same number of women, but there's more demand for family planning in the highest quintile. So the circle is bigger, the need is bigger, and in this case, we can actually change need by changing demand. Get into how we'd actually go about calculating use and need. for one of your projects, the program analytics team would actually do most of the calculations for use to percent of need, or we'd support you in doing that. It's very much a collaborative process. So, we work with you to get agreement on how need is defined and use is defined in a particular project and for a particular intervention. And we work with you to identify the best data to use. Often it's survey data or census data, and use that to make the calculations. And once we've gotten the identified how we're defining things, we also have to think through the target populations for a given intervention and really think what makes sense within the context of your project.